It is Sunday the 31st of January 2016. I'm in front of the Unitarian Church in Montreal. I'm into the second hour of my alternative spiritual practice of protesting against Unitarian Universalist injustices, abuses, and hypocrisy. Just wrapped up about a little over an hour of protesting this morning. And starting into a second hour, but I probably won't be protesting all that much longer. But yeah, we're just starting up a fresh reel, as it were. So it's been a pretty good day of protest. Had a couple of interesting conversations with people, as is often the case. And actually, yeah, one of the most recent ones, just at the end of the previous video clip, was a young woman who was approaching the church and stopped and asked me what the protest was about. And I told her it was about a variety of issues, and one of the issues, which actually isn't on the picket signs right now, because the picket signs that address that issue managed to get misplaced, as it were. I accidentally left them at another protest and forgot to bring them with me and was not able to retrieve them. In any case, I told this young lady that one of the more recent issues was that the Unitarian Universalist Association had hired Stikeman Elliott, barristers and solicitors litigation lawyer, Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe, to falsely accuse me of the criminal act of blasphemous libel in Bill Cosby-style legal bullying that's clearly intended to intimidate me into removing blog posts about certain Unitarian Universalist ministers who are in fact guilty of engaging in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. Just using some choice phrases from Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe's own arrogant and aggressive cease and desist demand letters there. So, this woman, her first question was, well, is it true or not, kind of thing. She wanted to know, and actually, the ministers, the Unitarian Universalists that I blogged about, were actually convicted of such despicable crimes, pedophilia and rape, so there's nothing unfounded about my allegations. They aren't remotely blasphemous libel against the Unitarian religious community, Unitarian Universalist religious community. And the woman came back and said, I actually had been planning to go in, but upon hearing that, she was no longer interested in going in. And I said, well, I'm not stopping you from going in, but just like many other churches, what this church claims in its, tracts and claimed principles and ideals and so on is essentially bullshit, because they don't actually live up to their claimed principles and purposes. Now, of course, I'm not saying that Unitarian Universalists never at any time live up to their claimed principles and purposes, but unfortunately, all too often, and perhaps especially when clergy misconduct is involved, Unitarian Universalists do a terrible job of practicing what Unitarian Universalist principles and ideals call for. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, second principle of Unitarian Universalism. Well, when it comes to a person filing a complaint against a minister for clergy misconduct, whether it's clergy sexual misconduct or non-sexual forms of clergy misconduct, justice, equity, and compassion go right out the door. Not only does the Unitarian Universalist Association and its very aptly named Ministerial Fellowship Committee do everything it can to refuse any justice or equity, and often in a very uncompassionate manner, but it will even actively seek to pervert justice, to prevent justice, to prevent any kind of fairness or equity, to ensure that the person complaining about the clergy misconduct is, their complaint is dismissed, they're intimidated into silence, they're expelled from the church, and so on. Right up to having people arrested on bullshit criminal charges, right up to falsely accusing yours truly of the criminal act of blasphemous libel for telling the truth about Unitarian Universalists who'd actually been convicted of pedophilia and or rape. Just covering up the truth as much as they can. And on that issue, the fourth principle of Unitarian Universalism is calling upon Unitarian Universalists to engage in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. But when someone complains about the clergy misconduct, you can be pretty sure that the exact opposite happens. Not only does the church refuse to engage in a free and genuinely responsible search for the truth and meaning of the complaint against the minister, but it will seek to hide that truth. It will seek to intimidate the complainant into silence. It will do everything it can to cover up and hide the truth. It will even outright lie in order to hide the truth from the public. The false blasphemous libel accusation that was brought against me by the UUA is one example of the Unitarian Universalist Church outright lying to hide the truth about Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, indeed pedophilia and rape committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers, say nothing of Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teachers and so on. It doesn't end there. It didn't end there. When the UUA falsely accused me of blasphemous libel in its efforts to hide the truth, I said, well, sorry, this is an outright lie. You will withdraw the false accusation. You will publicly apologize for bringing it against me. And additionally, you will tell the truth about just how many Unitarian Universalist ministers have actually been convicted of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. And you will also disclose the truth about how many Unitarian Universalist ministers have been credibly accused of pedophilia and or rape, even if those accusations never made it to a court of law. So you will name and provide the number, the amount, how many Unitarian Universalist ministers were actually convicted in a court of law of pedophilia or rape or both. And you will also say how many other Unitarian Universalist ministers had complaints about rape or pedophilia brought against them internally that never made it to a court of law, but which nonetheless were credible complaints. Of course, none of these things happen. And to make matters even worse, UUA moderator Jim Key stood up in front of thousands of Unitarian Universalists in his first moderator's report to a Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly, and he outright lied about Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual abuse of children in what was supposed to be an apology to victims of clergy misconduct. So on the one hand, he's supposedly apologizing for clergy sexual misconduct committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers. On the other hand, he's effectively outright denying the existence of any clergy sexual misconduct against children, or elders, by the way. That was another part of his statement. In his, what I consider to be worthless apology, because it contains outright lies, Jim Key said these words: "There were no incidents of abuse of children or elders in my investigations." That's an exact quote from his sorry excuse for an apology, if you don't mind that little pun there. So, you know, what's he saying? You know, he's saying that he personally investigated clergy sexual misconduct committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers, and in his investigations of Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, he didn't find any evidence of children or elders being sexually abused by Unitarian Universalist ministers. This is completely and utterly false and, quite frankly, ludicrous. I personally told Jim Key about Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell's rape of teenage Tibetan refugees. I personally told Jim Key about cases of sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist ministers that resulted in the conviction of clergy sexual abuse against children in a court of law. There aren't a whole lot of cases, at least there aren't a whole lot that are publicly known, but I'm trying to think. I'm not going to give out a number, but there's more than a handful of cases of Unitarian Universalist ministers being convicted of sexual abuse of children and sent to jail for their sex crimes against children. But Jim Key, in what was supposed to be an apology, pretended that he was not aware of any Unitarian Universalist minister ever sexually abusing a child. This is just utterly shameful, outright lie. Jim Key not only was in a position to know about these things if he had done a full and proper investigation of Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, but as I said, I personally told him of several cases where Unitarian Universalist ministers had been convicted of committing sex crimes against children and sent to jail for them. And I'm sure that other Unitarian Universalists know even more than I do about such things. There are Unitarian Universalist ministers, there are Unitarian Universalist lay leaders who I'm sure are better informed about these things than I am, who know of more cases of either pedophilia or rape or a combination of both committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers. I can't imagine that if Jim had asked them about such things that they wouldn't disclose them to him. I find it almost impossible to believe that UU Safety Net did not inform UUA moderator Jim Key about clergy sexual abuse of children. I find it almost impossible to believe that Reverend Fred Muir and other advocates of clergy misconduct victims in the past did not tell Jim Key about cases of Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual abuse of children. I cannot imagine that Reverend Deborah Pope Lance never told Jim Key. Well, actually, who knows? Maybe Jim Key didn't talk to Reverend Deborah Pope Lance at all. Maybe his investigations were far from adequate. But the fact remains is that even if we pretend that no other person told Jim Key about cases of clergy sexual abuse of children committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers, I personally told him in emails and one phone conversation that lasted for an hour and a half, in which I recorded my side of and posted to the internet. Jim Key was told about the fact that Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell had been convicted of raping teenage Tibetan refugees who he had lured away from their families in India with promises of a better life in America. Jim Key was told about several cases where Unitarian Universalist ministers had been convicted of sexual abuse of children and sentenced to jail terms for these convictions. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if I brought up the case of Stephen Craig Bullite, who was not a minister but who was a religious educator, Sunday school teacher, who was convicted of basically raping a boy who he had adopted. So this was not a parishioner per se, but it's still sexual abuse of a child committed by a Unitarian Universalist religious educator. There are other cases of such things, but the Stephen Craig Bullite one is a recent one that is publicly known. No, just truly incredible how Unitarian Universalists just fall all over themselves to make a total mockery of the claimed principles and purposes of Unitarian Universalism, totally violating the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, starting with respect for the inherent worth and dignity of every victim of clergy sexual misconduct committed by a Unitarian Universalist minister, starting with refusing to provide justice, equity, and compassion in their human relations with victims of clergy misconduct of all kinds, sexual or otherwise. Refusal to engage in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning.